Today I'm going to be doing a brief overview of the Love Canal tragedy. This is going to be a brief overview of some basic policies and principles. So the Love Canal, it is located in Niagara Falls, New York. As you can see there depicted on the map, it is on the United States side, and there's a couple pictures of the site. Brief history: in 1890, the Love Canal envisioned to be a model planned community. In 1920, the project fell through. Most of the site was used as a dump site for municipal uses and for other things within the city of Niagara Falls. In 1940, the site was purchased by Hooker Chemical Company. They utilized the site to dump 21,800 short tons of chemical byproducts for manufacturing of dyes, perfumes, and solvents for rubber and synthetic resins. In 1953, the Hooker Chemical Company sold the property to the local school district. The sale occurred under the pressure of eminent domain. What was kind of unfortunate but funny at the same time is the site was sold for just $1 to the Niagara School Board. Neighborhoods and schools were built on top of the site since then. In the year of 1970, residents complained of foul odors, which prompted the New York State Studies to investigate, and they found that when heavy precipitation occurred when it rained, the groundwater table would rise, and then the toxic chemicals would surface. In 1976, routine door-to-door health surveys found that high and unexplained rates of asthma, migraines, epilepsy, and high rates of birth defects existed just within this neighborhood alone and not in the surrounding neighborhoods or towns. So in 1977, essentially the EPA and the New York Health Department got involved. They started investigating the groundwater in the site and the continuing complaints. With that said, in 1978, the president at the time, Jimmy Carter, received word of the ongoing health crisis at the site, and he eventually declared a public health emergency. Federal funds were used to aid in the crisis, which is the first in history in which federal funds were used outside of a natural disaster, such as a hurricane or earthquake. In 1980, severity of site contamination led to the creation of legislation known as the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, known as CERCLA, or the Superfund Law of 1980. This was huge, and this set precedent within the EPA and with environmental law and policy itself. This was essentially the forefront of a completely new law with a set of regulations that never had existed prior. Several evacuations started again, which went up to the year of 1982. Over 1,000 households were evacuated from the site. In 1994, John Curtin, who was a U.S. federal judge, ruled over Hooker that they were negligent, but they were not found to be proven reckless at that time in the court of law. In the year of 1995, the corporation agreed to pay just about $129 million to cover up the cleanup costs since being sued by the Environmental Protection Agency. In 2004, it was deemed that the site was no longer posing a risk to the population, which we'll discuss further in the next slide. Lois Gibbs, I wanted to include her because she was huge in women's rights as well as activism, as well as one of the forefronts of environmentalism. Believe it or not, she was a major influence to the EPA as well for creating Superfund, as well as some of the other CERCLA policies. She was founded for the Center for Health and Environment and Justice. She was a household wife who lived in the Love Canal and who became concerned about the health of the children in the community. This led to her activism, which brought about political and public awareness of the situation in the year of 1978. She had prompted mandatory government evacuations of the site, influenced Jimmy Carter to visit the site, and she collected data which showed patterns of her family's illnesses in comparison to other nearby residences. She founded the Love Canal Homeowners Association, and she led the community to battle against local, state, and federal governments. She had essentially unearthed the history of the site and brought about public awareness of the previous use of the site. It is important to keep in mind that back in the 70s and 80s, there was no internet or social media sites, and it was really hard to get public documentation. So unless you went into a library or a government agency itself and requested the files, you really wouldn't have had any previous knowledge of the site unless you have lived in that area for a long period of time. So for her to dig up the information, let alone to really publicize it as much as it did, and to give it to the media outlets, was huge at the time. And a lot of people did not know the previous usage or the dangers of these chemicals at that time. So this was huge. Her effects were known to have been one of the driving forces to the Environmental Protection Agency creation of the Superfund. So it's just some policy about it. The Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, known as CERCLA, and the Superfund Law of 1980 had been developed. The site was placed on the Superfund's program National Priorities List, known as NPL. Amendments of the Superfund law were enacted in the year of 1986, specifically according to the U.S. EPA Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act of 1986, known as SARA, were enacted. Section 312 of SARA was also mandated. The Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act was enacted. The Section 312 of SARA state the EPA is to manage property acquisitions and habitability investigations associated with the Love Canal Emergency Declaration Area, or EDA. Some environmental health assessments. Studies did not prove conclusively that the chemicals were the primary culprit of the illnesses at the first testing did begin, or the initial reports at the site. Chemicals later found to be at the site were benzene and polychlorinated dibenzodioxins. There'll be a chemical inventory list later, which includes the more in-depth and chemical regulatories that were documented. Blood tests were issued by the Department of Public Health in '79, which showed having high white blood cell counts and chromosome damage did exist to those living in that community. The United States National Research Council later researched the health studies further and found that the major exposure was through groundwater, not the drinking water. Exposure is primarily due to seeping groundwater into basements, as well as exposure through soil and air. If you ever take Scott Simonton's class for environmental site assessment or risk assessment, you'll use the Regional Assessment Guidelines Handbook, which goes over the different types of ingestion and goes over the basic math equations, which show ingestion rates for infants, adults, as well as elderly individuals, and how different rates of exposure affect the body and how and when at different times, depending on the exposure and stuff like that. So that's a real beneficial course to have. So Superfund, what is it? Contaminated sites that exist because of hazardous wastes that have been left unmanaged. Love Canal and Valley of the Drums were the two case scenarios that received national attention. CERCLA allows the EPA to clean up the contaminated sites. The Act also allows for the EPA to hold parties reasonable or responsible for the contaminants of the site. This includes forcing them to do cleanups or reimburse the government for the cleanup of the work. Four goals of Superfund, according to the EPA website, are to protect human health, make responsible parties to compensate, involve communities in the process, and to return such site to a productive and economical, valuable use. Performance measures, which you'll see in CERCLA, which you can just read there or go to the website, but essentially you're going to have the categories of performance measure, status of the Superfund site, as well as the definitions of what it means, the performance measurements, which is essentially if it's how the human exposure is going on. The status is yes or no, is it a Superfund site? And the definition, again, you're going to look at it and say yes or no as far as the indications of it, whether it's currently acceptable or unacceptable to human exposure pathways, and as whether the EPA has determined it under control for human exposure. So you can read more into detail on that on the EPA's website and under CERCLA. Contamination list. This list contains the following categories: contaminant name, contaminated media, area of the site found, more information, and the CAS number. The following list is only a few of the contaminants found. The complete list can be found under the Love Canal Superfund document under Health and Environment. The contaminant lists it lists all the chemicals of concerns, which is COCs. As you can see, you have arsenic, benzene, and benzyl chloride, to name a few. So important acronyms for the Superfund: CAS, Chemical Abstract Service. This is really important. This is under the American Chemical Society. These are the regulatory numbers that are used in signing the numeric identifiers for a certain substance. The number does not have any chemical significance. It's just a reference to the chemical. So when one does find a chemical, they can find the resources necessary to further research such chemical. So it's a reference number. And thank you for watching, and my sources are listed below. Superfund cleanup measures. So with all this said, how did Superfund, how did CERCLA, how did SARA, how did all this come together, and what did it do? essentially the New York Department of Health, they installed a system to collect any sort of leachings from the site. In 81, the EPA installed a fence around the nearby site and started to conduct environmental studies. In 82, the EPA selected a remedy to contain the landfill by installing a barrier drain and collection system under the decision document. A clay cap was added to prevent the rain from reaching the chemicals during high precipitation rainfall. In 85, EPA worked on cleaning up the sewers, creeks, and berms. Thermal treatment of sewers and creek sediment was completed in 87. In 88, the record of decision, you may see that as ROD, excavated about 7,500 cubic yards of contaminated soil next to the 93rd Street school property. And then we get into Section 312 of CERCLA that states that the LCARA is to receive funds from the EPA when purchased, and the EPA and the affected properties in the EDA home maintenance program. And essentially, all that meant was maintenance and technical work was to be done by on those properties. 2.5 million EPA funds were granted to the purchase of the properties of the site. Program had 2 phases, both of which discontinued in the year of 2003 when it was suspected that no more contaminants was affecting public or human health. Currently, EPA does an environmental assessment, site assessment, or monitoring program, I should say, for which volatile organic compounds as well as semi-volatile organic compounds and PCPs are monitored. So pentylchlorophenyl. So the testing was shown to have limited to no exceedances, and in some cases there were no chemicals that were able to be detected. The only exception being an overburden monitoring well, number 10135, which is around the barrier drain system near the original disposal location. Due to being located right where the contamination originated, these results were expected. So right now the site is back open. They did tear down the school and built ball fields there, and the houses that do exist have been deemed safe with current monitoring systems in place.